New tonight, Wisconsin's data center explosion and a new push to regulate them. As more and more continue to pop up, there's more and more concern about rising energy and water costs.
Wisconsin didn't run out of electricity. For years, Wisconsin was doing something that sounds impossible in modern America, using less power overall. Not because people stopped buying things, not because the economy froze. It happened slowly. Efficiency got better, some big industrial loads faded, and the grid learned how to do more with less. Then a new kind of customer showed up, and this customer doesn't behave like a neighborhood. It doesn't behave like a factory. It doesn't even behave like a normal business that spikes at noon and relaxes at night. It behaves like a second city that never sleeps. That's what a modern data center can be. A warehouse for digital goods. A physical home for the thing everyone calls the cloud. In fact, one explanation in the reporting put it bluntly. The cloud isn't in the air. It's inside these buildings. Rows of servers, storage, network equipment, and a lot of supporting hardware. And when that kind of load arrives, it doesn't just use electricity, it rearranges the system. So today, we're going to walk through how data centers are reshaping Wisconsin's energy system, why it's happening, where the pressure builds first, and how the bill can end up landing on the rest of us, even if we never step inside one of these facilities. Because in energy, every story is about six forces: supply, demand, infrastructure, capital, policy, time. And Wisconsin is about to get a crash course in all six at once. Let's start simple, because the whole debate gets weird when people picture the wrong thing. A data center is not a tech campus full of engineers writing code in glass conference rooms. One source describing staffing needs made the point that large data centers don't necessarily need lots of programmers on site. They need people who can set up hardware, monitor it, and handle failures. They also need people to keep the building itself running. Cooling, power systems, physical maintenance. So if you're expecting the job footprint of a car plant, you might be disappointed. If you're expecting an industrial electrical footprint, you might be shocked. And that's why location decisions matter. Wisconsin has been pitched as attractive for a few reasons described in the reporting. It sits near large metros like Chicago and Milwaukee, which can help with staffing. It also has a generally cooler climate, which can lower cooling energy needs, and access to Lake Michigan can help with water needs for cooling. That last part, cooling, sounds boring until you realize cooling is one of the main reasons these facilities drink electricity and water at the same time. And once a few giant projects land, others follow. This is the cluster effect. Utilities plan around them. Contractors learn the process. Local governments start seeing a new kind of tax base. The state becomes a target. But there's another side to it. A data center isn't just a private business decision. It can be a grid decision for everyone nearby. Which is why Wisconsin's data center story quickly stops being about tech and becomes about energy. Here's the key background most people miss. Over the long term, Wisconsin's utilities were living through declining usage. Wisconsin Policy Forum reported that since 2005, total energy sales by Wisconsin utilities fell by 9%, and peak demand dipped by 2.6% over the period they referenced. That is not how people talk about electricity. We're used to thinking demand only goes up. But the grid is priced and built around a different metric than most people realize: peak demand. Peak demand is that moment, often on the hottest days, when everyone's running air conditioning and the system gets tight. And the forum's report explains why that matters. If available power plants can't meet peak, you can get brownouts, or in extreme cases, blackouts. Now here's the pivot. Based on utility projections filed with the state regulator, peak demand is expected to increase to about 17.1 gigawatts in the next 5 years, with new data centers cited as the primary driver. Think about what that means. Wisconsin spent decades adapting to a world where total sales drifted down and peak demand was basically flat. Utilities retired older coal units. They invested in cleaner generation. They learned how to operate a system where growth wasn't guaranteed. Then data centers show up and the forecast jumps. And the reason utilities react so strongly is simple. These facilities often behave like steady industrial-scale load. The forum notes that data centers have high and consistent energy needs, and their use is relatively uniform throughout the year compared with many other customer types. So you're not just adding demand, you're adding demand that doesn't give back during off-seasons. That changes the math for generation. It changes the math for transmission. And it changes the politics of rates, because the grid has to stay reliable whether your biggest customer is a neighborhood or an always-on server farm. So let's talk about what the system builds next. When a large new load arrives, utilities have two basic jobs. Job 1, produce enough energy over time. Job 2, produce enough power at the exact moment demand peaks. Those aren't the same problem. Wisconsin's utilities have been pulling older coal-fired plants offline and shifting toward more renewables, as described in the Policy Forum discussion of the changing generation landscape. However, when you add large, steady load and the system's peak demand starts rising again, reliability becomes the word everyone leans on. And in the same report, the forum describes utilities planning new natural gas-fueled capacity to keep service reliable during peak demand. This is where the energy story becomes a system story. Solar and wind are part of the picture. However, a grid that's planning around new peaks also asks a blunt question. What is dispatchable when the system gets tight? And in Wisconsin, the answer that shows up in filings and planning discussions is often natural gas. Now add the invisible part, wires. The forum points out that each facility might be a small slice of statewide total electricity. But the planned data centers are not evenly distributed, and many are located in smaller communities where they can represent an enormous increase in local energy use, forcing major investments in transmission lines. That's how you end up with an argument that sounds like it's about a building, but is really about power lines crossing farmland, property values, and who gets to say yes. In Port Washington, for example, reporting tied rising infrastructure questions to community resistance around transmission routes that would be needed to serve a major project there. And in DeForest, residents packed a meeting that ran for hours, with a lot of the opposition centered on energy and water usage and environmental impacts. So by the time a data center becomes real, it has already become something else. A local infrastructure negotiation, a rate debate, a land use fight, a trust and transparency fight, and all of that happens before we even get to the most sensitive part of the story. Who pays? That's the part that makes people tense because it touches everyone. Wisconsin's electric utilities are regulated. The Policy Forum describes that rate structures and changes to electricity prices are subject to approval by the Public Service Commission. And utilities can charge different rates to different types of customers so long as the rate design is tied to usage. In plain English, the Public Service Commission has to sign off, and the state has levers to decide how costs get allocated. But history matters here because Wisconsin ratepayers already carry a heavy legacy cost. A Wisconsin Watch investigation described how customers throughout the state owe nearly $1 billion on stranded assets, power plants that have been or will soon be shut down, still being paid off long after they stop producing electricity. One example in that reporting is the Pleasant Prairie plant. It shut down in 2018, but customers will keep paying for it until 2039. So Wisconsin is heading into the data center build-out already sensitive to a core fear. What if the system overbuilds again? Utilities earn returns on major investments approved by regulators, which is part of why the stranded asset conversation exists in the first place. The Wisconsin Watch piece frames the next risk directly. If unprecedented new generation and transmission are built for data centers, and the demand doesn't pan out as projected, the state could wind up with another cycle of stranded assets, where everybody else is left holding the bag. This is not a conspiracy. It's not even personal. It's structure. Demand forecast goes up, infrastructure gets approved, costs get recovered over decades. If the load later changes and the financing doesn't vanish, the system then argues about who covers the remainder. So the question becomes, can Wisconsin design rules that match costs to the customer creating them? You can see that exact logic showing up in utility proposals. The Policy Forum notes that We Energies has already proposed a differential rate for large electricity users like data centers, aimed at making those customers responsible for paying their share of new infrastructure and the costs of the energy they use. That is the economic heart of the entire debate. Not are data centers good or are they bad? Rather than that, it's if they reshape the grid, who is financially responsible for the reshaping? And if you zoom out, it gets even more intense because Wisconsin's planning framework is also part of the controversy. The Wisconsin Watch investigation highlights that Wisconsin does not have a state requirement for integrated resource plans like some neighboring states, and that project approvals can happen in a piecemeal way rather than through one comprehensive plan. In a world where demand is stable, piecemeal can feel manageable. In a world where demand suddenly jumps because a handful of very large customers might arrive, piecemeal can get expensive fast. So the political system steps in. Wisconsin isn't treating data centers as just another development proposal anymore. It's trying to build a regulatory framework around them, in real time. One report describes legislation being put together by State Senator Jody Habush-Sinekin with the goal of holding data centers accountable, imposing requirements connected to energy rates, water usage, and green building standards. That same reporting captures the kinds of questions residents are asking: water usage, climate impacts, and how projects might affect utility and energy rates. Then a second bill enters the picture. Another report says a bill authored by Representative Shannon Zimmerman and Senator Romaine Quinn aims to prevent residents from shouldering the costs of new grid construction that primarily serves a data center by telling the Public Service Commission, in effect, do not allocate those costs to other customers. That bill also includes water-related requirements, recycling, and annual reporting, and adds a cleanup requirement if a project is abandoned, requiring land to be restored to its original state. So now you can see the shape of the state's response: transparency, cost allocation, water reporting, and a what if this fails clause. Those are not random. They map directly to what people fear. They fear paying for a private customer's grid build. They fear water impacts in small communities. They fear a boom that leaves behind infrastructure debts. And because the bills are coming from different political angles, the story becomes less about party and more about incentives. Because both sides can agree on one thing: the grid is a shared system, and a single new customer can force costs onto everyone else if rules don't block that. That said, policy doesn't resolve the local fight. It just changes the terms of the fight. If you want to understand why this debate gets emotionally intense, watch where it happens. A proposed project in Dane County tied to QTS data centers is described as a nearly 1,600-acre campus, and a lot of the local conflict in the reporting is less about technology and more about land and transparency. In Deep Forest, residents pushed for an ordinance that would require big annexations to go to voters, essentially trying to force a referendum process for large land decisions. Village leaders did not sign off, and the debate turned into a clash between the idea of direct public votes and the practical reality of development approvals and legal exposure. That's not a footnote. It's a signal. When energy infrastructure is on the line, substations, transmission corridors, water mains, the normal development process starts to feel like it isn't designed for projects of this scale. And that's when people begin talking about farmland as a finite resource and about whether local officials are being transparent enough. One report quotes residents arguing the land itself is the irrecoverable loss, even if standards are improved. And another captures the meeting room reality: hours of public comment, the community divided between know and keep an open mind, and the board moving forward with private negotiations. So even if the grid math is manageable on paper, the politics can become unmanageable on the ground. And then you add the second utility system: water. Water is where this story gets subtle, because if you say millions of gallons, it sounds massive, and it can be in local terms. One report describing the Mount Pleasant project says the city released figures showing the data center will need more than 8 million gallons of water per year. However, the Wisconsin Policy Forum analysis also tries to put that into context. It points to Racine Water Works and says that between 1997 and 2022, annual water sales declined by 2.1 billion gallons, more than 250 times what that data center is expected to use when fully operational. So depending on your frame, the same number can mean two different things. In a statewide context, some systems have had falling demand for decades, and a new large user can help spread fixed costs. In a local context, a single facility can still force new mains, new pumping capacity, or new treatment decisions, and it can still raise hot day questions. The sources also describe newer closed-loop designs intended to dramatically reduce water consumed, and they tie that to water quality concerns since only small amounts flow into surface waters. That's the technology side, but the political side is transparency. Because if residents don't trust the projections, if they feel like water numbers and energy numbers aren't being disclosed early, then the debate stops being about gallons. It becomes about credibility. And you can see this theme over and over in the reporting. Communities asking for straight answers, lawmakers talking about basic frameworks for transparency, and utilities trying to reassure customers they won't be stuck paying for someone else's upgrades. So where does all of this land for everyday people? Back at the grid bill. Here's what's real. Peak demand is projected to rise to around 17.1 gigawatts, and data centers are cited as a main driver of that change. That kind of shift pushes utilities toward new infrastructure, generation, transmission, and upgrades designed around reliability. The regulator, the Public Service Commission, sits in the middle because it approves rate structures and has to decide how costs are recovered. Wisconsin customers already carry long-lived costs from older plants that were shut down, and the fear is repeating that cycle if the new build-out is larger than what demand ultimately supports. So the everyday life translation looks like this. If cost allocation is tight and disciplined, if large users pay for the infrastructure they trigger, then the grid can expand without forcing everyone else to subsidize it. However, if cost allocation drifts or planning becomes fragmented, the risk isn't just higher bills. The risk is long-term financial baggage locked into rates for decades. And there's one more layer, hiding behind all of it. Time. Because the grid is slow. You can build a data center faster than you can build a power plant, faster than you can permit a transmission line, and faster than you can rewrite the state's regulatory toolkit. So Wisconsin is trying to do something difficult. Grow the system while rewriting the rules of growth. If you only take one idea from this story, take this. Data centers don't just arrive and plug in. They pull on the grid like gravity. They change the forecast. They change what gets built. They change which wires matter. They change how regulators talk about fairness. They change what local development means. And Wisconsin's debate is really one big question dressed up in 100 smaller ones. When a private customer reshapes a shared grid, what does a fair deal look like? Should a data center pay higher rates to cover new plants and new lines? Utilities are already proposing mechanisms like differential rates for that purpose. Should state law explicitly block costs from being shifted onto everyone else? Wisconsin lawmakers are already trying to do that through proposed bills. Should communities be able to slow the process until transparency is complete, especially when land and water systems are involved? You can see that fight happening in real time in places like DeForest. Because at the end of the day, the cloud isn't floating. It's physical. It sits on land. It demands power. It needs cooling. And it forces decisions that last longer than any single election cycle.